They wanted to kill a man whose only crime was being alive, not a criminal, not a revolutionary, not someone who had broken a single law or wronged a single person, a man who had simply come back from the dead. And for that, the most powerful religious leaders in all of Israel sat down together and made a plan to murder him. That is what is hiding inside John 12:10. And once you see it, once you truly understand what is in that single verse, you will never read a room full of religious people the same way again. Welcome to Bible Unfiltered, the channel where we go where we need to go. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe right now, because what we do here is not surface level. We go deep, we go honest, and we go all the way to the bone. This video is exactly that kind of study, because John is not just a verse, it is a spiritual X-ray machine. It is a tool that God placed inside His Word specifically so that you could look at what is happening around you right now, in your church, in your community, in your circle of so-called believers, and see clearly what your natural eyes cannot detect on their own. There are people in your life right now who have the language of faith down perfectly. They quote scripture, they post worship music, they have been in church longer than you have, they know all the right words to say in all the right moments.
And some of them, not all, but some, are operating with a spirit that is working tirelessly to destroy everything God is trying to build in your life. You need to know how to tell the difference, and John 12 is the map. Stay with me for this entire message. We are going to walk through every layer of this verse: the historical context, the spiritual meaning, the Greek word choices, the practical application for your life today in the 21st century. By the time we are done, you will have a completely different set of eyes that can see what is really going on behind certain attitudes, certain oppositions, certain comments, certain patterns of behavior in the people who surround you. Let us start at the very beginning, because you cannot fully understand what happens in chapter 12 of John without understanding who John was. His gospel is unlike anything else in the New Testament. John is different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Those are so many events in common that scholars call them the synoptic gospels. They basically see the same story from slightly different angles. John sees from somewhere else entirely. John writes from a place of extraordinary intimacy. He was the disciple described in his own gospel as the one Jesus loved, the one who leaned against Jesus, the one who stood at the foot of the cross when every other male disciple had scattered in fear.
When John writes his gospel, he is not interested in giving you a chronological biography. He is interested in one thing above all others: proving to you, beyond any shadow of intellectual doubt, that Jesus of Nazareth is the eternal Son of God who took on human flesh and our world to redeem it. He opens his gospel with a declaration that even today stops readers cold. John does not start with a manger or a genealogy. He starts before time existed. He starts with eternity. And that starting point matters enormously, because every miracle, every confrontation, every moment of tension in the Gospel of John carries that weight. The weight of God Himself walking among us. He wrote it from Ephesus, on the western coast of what we now call Turkey. By that point, he was the last living apostle. Everyone else was gone. The churches around him were battling his from two opposite directions, some who said Jesus was fully God but not really human, and others who said he was a great human teacher but certainly not divine. John writes to put both errors to rest permanently. And to do that, he builds his entire gospel around 7 specific miracles, 7 signs as he calls them, each one selected to reveal a different facet of the divine power and identity of Jesus. 7 is that this is not merely an extraordinary man. This is the creator of the universe working inside his own creation.
The 7th sign, the last, the greatest, the one that breaks every category and stands above all the others, is the resurrection of Lazarus. It happens in chapter 11, and it is that resurrection that creates the explosion of consequence that lands us in chapter 12, and ultimately in the single verse we are here to study today. You need to feel the weight of who Lazarus was before you can feel the weight of what the religious leaders wanted to do to him. Lazarus lived in Bethany, a small village less than 3 kilometers outside Jerusalem. He was the brother of Mary and Martha, 2 women who appear multiple times in the gospel accounts as deeply devoted followers of Jesus. It is not a general statement about universal divine love for all humanity. That is a specific declaration of personal friendship and personal affection. Lazarus was not just a follower of Jesus. He was a friend of Jesus, a close friend, a beloved friend, and that friend got sick. Now watch carefully what happens, because this is where the story gets strange and magnificent at the same time. Jesus received word that Lazarus was ill. The messenger came all the way from Bethany. The urgency in the message was clear. The family wanted Jesus to come immediately. And what does Jesus do?
The text says he stayed where he was for 2 more days. He did not go. He let the situation develop. He let Lazarus die. This is not negligence. This is intentional.
And it sets up the most staggering demonstration of power in the entire pre-resurrection narrative of the Gospels. By the time Jesus finally arrived in Bethany, Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days. 4 days. This detail matters in ways that cannot be overstated when you understand the cultural framework of first-century Judaism. There was a widespread belief at the time that the spirit of a deceased person could linger near the body for up to 3 days after death, creating at least the theoretical possibility of revival. But 4 days meant that window was shut. 4 days meant the process of physical decomposition was already well underway. 4 days meant there was absolutely no natural explanation available. Whatever was about to happen could not be explained by anything but raw divine power. Martha came out to meet Jesus on the road before he even entered the village. And she said something that is one of the most beautiful and painful things in Scripture. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." This is not pure faith without grief. This is faith drenched in grief. This is someone who loves Jesus and trusts Jesus and also wants to know why Jesus allowed something so painful to happen. And Jesus meets her exactly there, in that complicated intersection of faith and loss. He says to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. I am the resurrection. I am the life."
This is not a skill or a gift or a power Jesus exercises. This is who he is. Death itself is subject to his identity. They walked to the tomb. The crowd of mourners who had come to comfort the family walked with them. And then the text says something that has stopped readers and theologians and ordinary people in their tracks for 2,000 years. Jesus wept. The eternal God, the creator of every galaxy in every direction across the infinite expanse of the cosmos, the Word that spoke existence into being, stood in front of a tomb and cried. He was not crying because he did not know what he was about to do, knew exactly what he was about to do. He was not crying because he lacked the power to fix the situation. He was seconds away from demonstrating that he had absolute power over death itself. He wept because he loved. Because the grief of Mary and Martha was real and it mattered to him, because the human experience of loss, even temporary loss, even loss he was about to reverse, was something worth mourning. That detail alone should undo us completely. The God of the universe thought our grief was worth his tears. He opened from the tomb entrance. He prayed openly to the Father, not as a man seeking permission, but as a son speaking within relationship, making the moment a public act of theological declaration. And then he called into the darkness, with a voice loud enough for every person standing there to hear. And the dead man walked out.
Still bound from head to toe in linen strips, still wearing the face covering the burial customs required, he came out of that tomb under his own power, walking, breathing, alive. That was the moment. That was the 7th sign. That was the climax of everything John had been building towards since the first verse of his gospel. And it happened publicly. It happened within walking distance of Jerusalem. It happened in front of a crowd that would immediately carry the news straight to the city, specifically straight to the people who were watching Jesus most closely and with the most concern. Which brings us to what happened next. Many in the crowd who witnessed the resurrection believed in Jesus on the spot. John 11:45 records it simply. Many of the Jews who had come with Mary and who saw what he did believed in him. This was not a small spiritual ripple. This was a wave. Lazarus walking out of his own is the kind of event that rearranges people's fundamental assumptions about reality. But others in the crowd went to report what had happened to the Pharisees. And when the Pharisees received that report, they called an emergency council meeting with the chief priests, a formal gathering of the most powerful religious leaders in Israel. And what they said in that meeting reveals everything you need to know about the spirit that was operating in them. What are we to do? For this man performs many signs.
The miracle was not in dispute. A man had been dead for 4 days and was now walking around having dinner with his family. They were not what had happened. They were terrified of what it meant for their position, their influence, their institutional power, and their relationship with Rome. The place they referenced was the temple, the center of their religious, political, and economic authority. That was what they were really protecting, not truth, not God, not the people they were supposed to serve, their place. And it was in that charged atmosphere that the high priest that year
stood up and said something that was one of the most cynical and most prophetically accurate statements in all of Scripture. You know nothing at all. John immediately adds a note that stops you cold. Caiaphas did not say this of his own accord. He was high priest that year, and so he prophesied. He spoke more truth than he thought he was making a calculating political argument for why Jesus needed to be eliminated to preserve the institution. He had no idea he was articulating the entire theology of atonement. Jesus would indeed die for the people, not to protect the Sanhedrin's political arrangements with Rome, but to reconcile a broken humanity to a holy God.
Even through the mouth of a corrupt and power-hungry religious leader, the truth of God's eternal plan found its way out. After that meeting, the decision was made. Jesus had to die, and the machinery of that plot began to turn. Now we arrive in chapter 12, where we need to follow the story carefully, because this is where John 12:10 emerges. 6 days before Passover, Jesus returns to Bethany. A dinner is given in his honor at the home of a man named a man who had himself been healed of leprosy, which is significant. Martha, ever the one with her hands in practical service, is doing the serving. Lazarus dining at the table with Jesus. And then Mary does something that divides the room. She comes in with a pound of pure nard, an extraordinarily expensive aromatic oil imported from the Himalayan region, worth approximately a year's wages for an ordinary laborer. She pours the entire thing over Jesus' feet, and then she does something even more startling. She lets down her hair, which in the social culture of first-century Jewish society was a deeply intimate and even controversial gesture, and she uses her heat, the entire house filled with the fragrance. Judas Iscariot objected, cloaking his greed in the language of concern for the poor. Jesus defended Mary with a statement that has reverberated through 20 centuries. Leave her alone.
He recognized the act for what it was, an anointing, an act of prophetic devotion, a gesture from someone who somehow understood that what was coming was not going to be stopped, and who was to pour everything she had onto Jesus while she still could. And then John gives us the detail that leads directly to the verse we are studying. A massive crowd of people from Jerusalem got word that Jesus was in Bethany. They came out, not just to see Jesus, but to see Lazarus, the man who had been dead, the man everyone knew had been in that tomb for 4 days. His existence was drawing people in. His being alive was functioning as an irresistible witness to the power of Jesus. And that is when we arrive at John 12:10. Read it again. Not only Jesus, Lazarus, the man who had been raised from the dead, the living testimony of Christ's power over the grave. They wanted him dead. Take a moment and let that fully register, because this is not incidental. This is not a footnote. This is the verse that pulls back the curtain on something that has been operating inside religious institutions since the very beginning of human history. These were not criminals in any ordinary sense. They were not dangerous men on the margins of society. These were the chief priests, the highest-ranking religious officials in all of Israel, the men whose names people invoked with reverence, the men to whom families brought their offerings, their sorrows, their questions about God. The men who wore the sacred garments, who managed the temple rituals, who held the most visible positions of spiritual authority in the Jewish world. And those men, those exact men, sat down together and made a deliberate, premeditated, collective decision to have an man killed. Not because he had done anything wrong, not because he posed any real threat, not because he had broken a single law, but because he was alive when he should have been dead, and his being alive was making people believe in Jesus, and that was intolerable. Not everything that looks like God is from God, and John burns that truth into the page so clearly that you cannot walk away from it unchanged. Now I want to slow down and go deeper, because the real power of this verse is not just in the broad outlines of what happened. It is in the specific details that John chose to include and the way he chose to describe them. Every word is there for a reason, on account of him, because of his existence, because of his presence, because of his story, not because of anything said or did after his resurrection. The text does not record Lazarus giving speeches or leading a movement or doing anything at all besides being at a dinner. He was simply there, alive. And the fact of his being alive, the fact that people could look at him and know that this was the man who had been in the tomb, was generating faith in Jesus. Lazarus was a bridge. He was the living evidence that made the impossible undeniable. And you could not argue with him, because he was standing right there. The Greek word translated as going away in verse 11 is apago, and it's the specific sense of departing from one place to move toward another. The people who were not just becoming generally more religious, they were departing from the sphere of influence of the chief priests and the established religious system and moving toward Jesus. That directional shift, that reorientation of loyalty and faith, was exactly what the religious leaders feared most. And this is a pattern you must understand, because it is the same pattern that operates today in every context where the spirit of destruction puts on religious clothing. When God does something genuinely powerful in a human life, that life becomes a Lazarus. When God restores a marriage that everyone around had already written the obituary for, when God heals a body that medical science had no answers for, when God breaks an addiction that had defined someone for decades, when God rebuilds a reputation, a family, a financial situation that had completely collapsed, that person's story becomes irresistible evidence of the reality and the power of Jesus Christ. And the mere telling of that story makes other people think, if God did that for them, maybe God could do that for me too. And that thought moves people toward Jesus.
That is exactly what Lazarus was doing, simply by being alive. And that is exactly what those who operate with a spirit of destruction cannot tolerate. Because while your testimony exists, while you keep showing up, keep living the life God gave back to you, keep telling people what He did, their narrative that God is absent, that faith is illusion, that nothing really changes, that there is no hope worth believing in, is being publicly and continuously contradicted. They cannot silence the miracle itself, so they go after the evidence of the miracle. They go after you. Now look at the word plans in the text. The chief priests made plans to put Lazarus to death. In the original Greek, the word used is eboulianto, from the root bouleo, which means to deliberate, to take counsel, to make a calculated and considered decision after discussion among a group. This was not an impulse. This was not one unstable person acting out of personal anger. This was a formal deliberation. They sat together, they discussed, they weighed options, and they arrived at a collective decision. This tells you something critical about the way the spirit of destruction operates when it has embedded itself into institutional religious structures. It does not act alone. It builds coalitions. It creates shared narratives. It constructs collective justifications that give each individual participant the psychological comfort of believing they are acting for the good of the community rather than from envy or fear. This spirit operates in your life today. It almost never looks like one person making one hostile decision against you. It looks like a group that has formed around a shared concern. It sounds like multiple voices expressing the same worries. It comes with the cover of collective wisdom and institutional authority, and that cover makes it extraordinarily difficult for people on the outside to see what is actually happening. The word "also" in the verse deserves its own moment of attention. The chief priests made plans to put Lazarus to death also. The primary plan was already in place against Jesus. Now they were expanding the operation to include the most visible living proof of what Jesus had done. There is a logic to this that reveals something important about the strategy of the destructive spirit. It starts with the source, with the most concentrated testimony of God's power. And when it cannot immediately neutralize that source, it expands to target everything connected to the source. Not just the tree, not just the fountain, but the rivers that flow from it. Not just Jesus, but Lazarus. When this spirit operates in your context, it often begins by targeting the person whose anointing or testimony is most publicly powerful.
But when that proves difficult, it's toward that person's community, their relationships, their support network, the people who have been transformed by contact with them. If it cannot stop the testimony, it tries to discredit the witnesses. If it cannot erase the miracle, it tries to undermine the one who experienced it. Stay with me, because we are just getting to the part that is going to change how you see everything. The chief priests who planned Lazarus's murder were not spiritually neutral people who had made one bad decision under pressure. They were the product of a long process of choosing institutional power over spiritual truth, and that process had taken them somewhere dark enough to plan the murder of an innocent man as a matter of religious policy. How does someone end up there? How does a religious leader arrive at a place where planning the killing of a resurrection testimony seems not only justified but necessary? It happens through what we might call the progressive substitution of a different priority system. Somewhere along the line,
not suddenly, but gradually. The thing they were supposed to serve was replaced by something they had started to worship. They were supposed to be servants of the living God, guides to a people in covenant relationship with heaven. But over time, without necessarily noticing the transition, they became servants of the institution, protectors of the structure, guardians of their own relevance.
And once that substitution is complete, the logic changes entirely. And the terrifying thing is that this substitution can happen while all the external religious forms remain perfectly intact. Are still recited, the scriptures are still quoted, the institution still functions with all the appearance of holy purpose, but the interior has been hollowed out and filled with something else entirely, which is why Jesus, who saw through every surface to what was actually operating inside people, said what he said in Matthew, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, a white tomb, gleaming on the outside, death on the inside, beautiful in appearance, corrupted in reality." That description was not limited to the first century. It describes a spiritual condition that can exist in any era, in any culture, under any religious banner, wearing any theological vocabulary. And John 10 is God's gift to us, the X-ray vision that allows us to see past the whitewash. Let us talk about what this looks like in practice. Because you did not click on this video just to learn ancient. You clicked because something in you recognized that the dynamic described in is not ancient history. It is happening somewhere near you, right now, today. The first marker of the spirit of destruction in a religious context is this: opposition intensifies precisely when God is doing his most powerful work.
Look at the timeline in the Gospel of John. The chief priests were not urgently plotting against Jesus during the early months of his ministry when he was in Galilee, healing people in relatively obscure locations. The emergency council that produced the decision to kill him was convened immediately after the resurrection of Lazarus, the single most publicly verifiable, most impossible to explain away miracle of his entire ministry. The biggest miracle, the most powerful testimony, the most undeniable evidence. That is when the opposition mobilized to its highest level of urgency. Think about your own experience. When did the attacks come? When did the rumors start? When did the criticism get loudest? If it was during a season when God was visibly doing something powerful in your life, when you were growing, when your ministry was bearing fruit, when your testimony was reaching people, when your restoration was becoming undeniable, that is not a coincidence. That is the pattern. The spirit of destruction does not waste its energy on things that are spiritually dormant. It mobilizes against things that are spiritually alive and producing faith in others. If the opposition intensifies exactly when the anointing intensifies, you need to take note, because opposition is sometimes a confirmation, not just a complication. The second marker is that they minimize the miracle rather than seek the one who made it. When the word of Lazarus' resurrection reached the chief priests, they did not ask, "How is this possible? Who has the authority to command death to reverse itself?" They looked at the most extraordinary supernatural event in living memory, and their immediate response was crisis management rather than inquiry. This is one of the most reliable signs you will ever encounter. When someone consistently meets the evidence of God's work in your life, not with wonder or questions, but with damage control and counter-narrative, that response is telling you something about what spirit is operating in. A genuine heart that is wrestling with spiritual truth, even a skeptical heart, responds to evidence with questions. How did this happen? Can I see it for myself? A heart operating from the spirit of destruction responds to evidence with spin. There's probably another explanation. We don't know the whole story. Not questioning from curiosity, deflecting from conviction. When someone in your life consistently responds to the evidence of God's work in your life, not with genuine inquiry, but with alternative explanations designed to minimize what God did, it was probably just the therapy. It was probably just time. It was probably just circumstances aligning. That pattern is worth paying close attention to. The third marker is that they cannot bring a specific charge. The chief priests never produced an accusation against Lazarus. They never brought a formal charge.
They never articulated a genuine wrong that he had committed, because there was none. The only thing he had done was experience a miracle and continue existing as evidence of that miracle. When someone is consistently working against you in your community or church context, but cannot articulate what specifically you have done wrong, when the objection to your presence is perpetually vague, when the concern is always expressed in generalities rather than specifics, when you are told there is something off about you or your situation, but no one can quite put their finger on what it is, that is important information. Genuine spiritual correction, the kind that comes from love and aims at restoration, is always specific. The opposition that comes from the spirit of destruction operates in fog. It creates an atmosphere of without providing any actual charges, because there are none. The problem is not what you did. The problem is what you represent. The fourth marker is that they operate collectively under the cover of institutional legitimacy. They did not simply let one priest privately decide he disliked Lazarus. They convened a formal council. They built a consensus, the decision in the authority of the institution. And once it had that institutional cover, it became extraordinarily difficult for ordinary people to question it. After all, who challenges the chief priests? Who walks into the Sanhedrin and says, "I think you have this wrong"?
The collective cover is one of the spirit of destruction's most effective tools. When the attack on your testimony character comes not from an identifiable individual, but from the leadership or the community or concerned members of the congregation, when it has been wrapped in the language of collective and institutional authority, it becomes much harder to address directly, because you are no longer dealing with a person. You are dealing with a structure, and the structure tells you implicitly, disagree with us, and you are disagreeing with God. Pay close attention to whether conversations about you happen with you or without you. A community genuinely concerned for your well-being will include you in the conversation about your well-being. A group operating with a spirit of destruction will exclude you from every conversation in which your is being decided, because including you would require them to be specific, to produce actual evidence, to engage with you as a full human being rather than a problem to be managed. The fifth marker, and this is perhaps the subtlest but also the most revealing, is the inability to genuinely celebrate what God does in others. Look at the two groups in Bethany. The crowd that witnessed the resurrection of Lazarus and came to the dinner in John 12. They were filled with awe, with curiosity, with faith, with the kind of excitement that happens when a miracle collides with a living human being.
Mary responded to the presence of the resurrected Lazarus and the nearness of Jesus by pouring everything she had onto his feet in an act of extravagant worship. The chief priests responded to the same event with a crisis meeting and an assassination plan. The same miracle. Two completely opposite responses. What happens in your heart when someone close to you experiences a breakthrough that you have been praying for yourself? What happens when someone in your congregation receives a healing, a promotion, a restoration, a recognition that you feel you may have deserved equally or more? What happens when someone whose ministry is newer than yours, whose gifts are less polished than yours, whose theological education is less extensive than begins to see more fruit than you are seeing? If the honest answer involves some complicated emotion that has to fight its way past a reflexive critical analysis of whether the blessing is deserved or real, that is something worth bringing before God in complete honesty, because the natural response of the Spirit of God in a person is to rejoice when a fellow member of the body is honored, even when that honor did not come to you. There is a pattern you will recognize in people operating with the spirit of destruction. Every celebration they offer comes with a qualifier, a shadow, that arrives just quickly enough to slightly darken the moment. Every gold medal of what God did gets a silver edge of suspicion attached.
That is the spirit of destruction wearing the mask of wisdom. You are still watching this because you know, somewhere in your gut, that this is real, that this is happening in your world. And the most important question is coming next. What do you do with this? How do you respond? What does God give you to actually protect yourself and your testimony? Do not move, because this is where it gets practical. The first and most foundational response is to do exactly what Lazarus did. Lazarus knew there was a plan against him. He knew powerful people wanted him dead. The text makes this clear. And what do we see Lazarus doing? He is reclining at the table with Jesus. He is at the dinner. He is present. He is not hiding. He is not mounting a public campaign to defend himself. He is not organizing his own counter-coalition of sympathizers. He is not composing public statements refuting the chief. He is at the table with Jesus. That is the most powerful thing you can do when the spirit of destruction is at work against you. Stay in the presence of Christ. Stay in worship. Stay in community with him. Stay at the table.
Do not make yourself invisible in response to the pressure of those who want your testimony silenced. Because if you disappear, if you stop showing up, stop speaking, stop being the living evidence of what God did, you have given them exactly what they wanted, without them having to lift another finger against you.
The spirit of destruction wins not when it destroys you, but when it causes you to destroy your own testimony by retreating in fear. Lazarus stayed at the table, and that is where God is calling you to stay. The second response is to develop active, practiced spiritual discernment. Not paranoia, but perception. Jesus himself modeled this with perfect clarity throughout his ministry. He did not treat every person who approached him with identical levels of trust and access. He loved everyone. His love was not selectively extended, but his trust was not equivalently distributed. He loved the Pharisees with a love that wept over Jerusalem and said, "Father, forgive them," from the cross. And he also did not give the Pharisees the intimate access to his interior life that he gave to Peter, James, and John. That is not inconsistency. That is wisdom. And it is a model for how you are meant to navigate your relationships. There is a world of difference between loving someone and giving them the keys to your heart. There is a world of difference between desiring good for someone and granting them unlimited access to your life, your ministry, your inner world, your vulnerabilities. Love covers everyone. Trust is earned over time. And discernment tells you who has earned what level of access. The question is, how do you develop that discernment so that it is genuinely from the Spirit and not just from accumulated wounds that make you suspicious of everyone?
3 specific practices emerge from the Gospel of John itself as the foundation for genuine spiritual discernment, and none of them involve becoming harder or more guarded as a human being. They involve becoming more deeply rooted. The first practice is sustained time in the presence of God. Jesus said in John 15, "Abide in me, and I in you." It is not a skill you develop by becoming a better analyst of human behavior. It is a fruit of communion with Christ. When you spend real, consistent, unhurried time in His presence, in prayer that goes past the surface, in the Word that goes past mere information to genuine encounter, He begins to give you a perception of situations and people that your natural senses cannot generate on their own. This is not mysticism. This is the ordinary functioning of a living relationship with a God who promised to guide you into all truth through His Spirit. The more time you spend with Him, the more attuned you become to the difference between what is of His Spirit and what is not. It is like living with someone whose footsteps you know so well that you can tell from down the hallway exactly who is walking toward you. The longer you live in close proximity to the character of Christ, the more quickly and clearly you recognize what does not match that character, in situations, in organizations, and in people. The second practice is patient observation rather than flowers. Not by their flowers. Flowers of a person's spiritual life are the external, public, observable behaviors, the things they do when they know they are being watched, the things they say in settings where their rep is being formed, the way they perform when an audience is present. Flowers are often beautiful, and they are often temporary. Fruit takes time. Fruit is what you see when you observe a person consistently across multiple seasons and multiple kinds of situations, especially situations that involve pressure, competition, failure, someone else's success, or private moments when the performance pressure is off. The chief priests were covered in flowers, their vest prayers, their public fasts, their detailed knowledge of the Torah, all flowers, all things that shone with the appearance of deep spirituality. But their fruit was a conspiracy to murder him whose only offense was being resurrected. Their fruit was the preference for their own position over the truth that God was presenting to them in the form of an undeniable miracle. You cannot accurately assess someone's spiritual reality from their flowers alone. You need to watch long enough to see their fruit, and fruit almost never appears in the first season. Give it time. Watch what happens when they do not get what they want. Watch what happens when someone else gets recognized instead of them. Watch what happens when their narrative collides with a fact that contradicts it.
Watch what happens in moments when they think no one significant is watching. The fruit will tell you things that no amount of impressive flower display can reveal. The third practice is submitting your perceptions to the Spirit for correction before acting on them. This is the practice that separates genuine discernment from spiritual paranoia. He is the guide, not your gut alone, not your past experiences with similar situations, not the pattern-matching engine on your memory, which has been shaped by both genuine wisdom and unhealed wounds. Before you make a significant decision based on what you perceive about a person or a community,
Bring that perception before God with genuine openness to being corrected. Ask Him, is what I am seeing real, or is my vision distorted by something that happens to me before? A genuine spirit of destruction, or am I projecting something from a past wound onto a present situation that is actually different? This takes real humility. It is much easier to trust your perception and move. It is much harder to pause and submit that perception to someone who might tell you that you are wrong about what you are seeing. But that pause is the thing that keeps discernment clean and prevents it from curdling into something that isolates you from genuine community.
Because here is what must be said with great care. Not everyone who challenges you, questions you, disagrees with you, or even causes you pain is operating with a spirit of destruction. Some people hurt you from their own unhealed places, not from deliberate malice. Some people question your judgment because they genuinely love you and see something you cannot see from your current vantage point. Some confrontations that feel threatening are actually gifts wrapped in uncomfortable packaging. The chief priests of John 12:10 were not people who were confused or hurting. They were not people acting from unconscious wounds. They were people who had made a series of conscious choices to prioritize their position over truth, and who had followed that priority to its logical conclusion, the deliberate planned elimination of a living witness to the power of God. That is a very specific kind of opposition that requires a very specific response. It is entirely different from the person in your life who says things that hurt, but who is genuinely oriented towards your good. Conflating those two categories does enormous damage to you, to them, and to the body of Christ. How do you tell the difference? In most cases, time, prayer, and the fruit question will give you clarity. But here is a rough compass. The confrontation that comes from love speaks to you directly, brings specific concerns, aims at restoration, and is as willing to hear you as to be heard.
The opposition that comes from the spirit of destruction works indirectly, traffics in generalities and atmosphere, aims at silencing or removal, and has no genuine interest in hearing your perspective because your perspective is not the point. One wants you to grow. The other wants you to disappear. One comes to your face. The other operates behind your back. One would the community. The other would experience profound relief. Now, I want to address something that does not get said often enough in conversations about spiritual opposition, and it has to do with us, with the people listening, rather than with the people we are observing. The chief priests did not become who they were overnight. There was no single moment where a good man woke up and decided to start planning the murders of innocent people. The trajectory that led them to John 12:10 was long. It was gradual. It was built from 1,000 smaller choices, each one prioritizing position over principle, reputation over reality, institutional loyalty over divine truth, and each small choice made the next one slightly easier until they arrived at a place that would have been unthinkable at the beginning of their careers, which means that the warning of John 12:10 is not only about who you, it is also about who you are becoming. Is there a Lazarus in your world?
Is there someone whose restoration, whose testimony, whose blessing produces something complicated in you that you have been calling discernment, but might actually be envy? Is there someone whose success in the area you care most about makes it genuinely difficult for you to celebrate them? Is there a conversation you participate in, maybe not in person, but in the voice inside your own head, or in occasional exchanges with your discomfort, that functions as a miniature version of the council the chief priests convened, a conversation whose real purpose is to manage the influence of someone whose impact makes you uncomfortable? These are not comfortable questions, but they are necessary ones, because the spirit of destruction does not only recruit people who have already become its full-throated servants. It begins with small invitations, an agreement with a criticism here, a decision to let us live rent-free in your mind there, a subtle satisfaction at that someone you envy is struggling, and left unexamined and unrepented of. Those small invitations gradually become larger ones. The antidote is not self-condemnation. The antidote is honesty, confession, and the genuine practice of celebrating what God does in others, even when it costs you something, even when the person God is blessing is someone whose gifts overlap with yours.
Even when the person whose testimony is reaching people is someone younger, less experienced, or less theologically, even when the applause is going to someone who, in your estimation, but than you are. That is a crucifixion of the ego. And it is exactly the kind of crucifixion that Paul described in Galatians 2:20. I have been crucified with Christ. The person who has genuinely been crucified with Christ can celebrate a Lazarus without any shadow of competitive resentment, because there is no self left to feel threatened. Let us talk about what happens to Lazarus after John 12:10. Because this matters more than almost anything else we have discussed. The chief priests made their plan. They included Lazarus in the conspiracy. They had the motive, they had the authority, they had the agreement of the council. By every worldly measure, Lazarus should have been dead within weeks. He was in the crosshairs of the most powerful religious institution in Israel. And yet, the Gospel of John does not record the death of Lazarus at the hands of the Sanhedrin. There is no passage in the New Testament that tells us the chief priest's plan against Lazarus succeeded. What we know from the text is that Jesus went to Jerusalem, was crucified, and rose from the dead. The entire machinery of the Sanhedrin's power was not sufficient to stop the purposes of God from moving forward.
And within that movement of divine purpose, Lazarus, the man they wanted dead, remained alive. The testimony that they wanted silenced continued to testify. The life that they had condemned continued to live. Now you might be thinking, that is a wonderful story about Lazarus. But what about me? What about the very real situations I face, the very real people who are working against me, the very real pain of being targeted by those who should be protecting you? And here is what the gospel says to you directly. The same God who called Lazarus out of the tomb by name, the same voice that penetrated 4 days of death and summoned a bound man to walk out into the daylight, that God knows your name too. That God sees the council meetings that are happening in your absence. That God is entirely aware of every agreement being formed against your testimony. And his purposes for your life are not subject to the approval of the people who want to contain you. This is not a promise that opposition will not hurt. It hurt Mary to hear people whispering. It hurt Martha to know that her brother was being targeted. The grief and the difficulty of navigating a world where religious power can be turned against you are real, and they deserve to be named. The gospel does not offer you anesthesia. It offers you something better, the assurance that what God has decided to build through your life cannot be demolished by what people have decided to destroy.
Psalm 2 opens with that very question. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? And God's response to all that raging and counsel-taking? He laughs, not with cruelty, but with the untroubled confidence of the one for whom no human plan poses even the theoretical possibility of a genuine threat. The plans of the chief priests against Lazarus were real. The plan of God for Lazarus was realer, infinitely realer. And the same is true for you. There is one more thing about Lazarus in the immediate context of chapter 12 that deserves your full attention, because it is the invitation that this entire study has been building toward. Lazarus was at the dinner. He was at the table. He was reclining with Jesus, and while he was doing that, while he was simply being present in the place of communion and fellowship, John 12:9 tells us that a great crowd of people came to see him. They came not only to see Jesus, but to see Lazarus. He did not have to go looking for them. He did not have to mount a campaign to restore his reputation or rebuild his testimony. He did not have to organize a public relations effort or craft a counter-narrative against the chief priests. He simply remained where he was, in the presence of Jesus, at the table of fellowship, and people came to him. The crowd came to where the miracle was. The seeker came to where the testimony lived. This is the invitation for every modern Lazarus. Stay at the table. Remain in his presence.
Keep showing up as the living evidence of what God has done in your life. Stop shrinking yourself to accommodate the discomfort of those who are threatened by your story. Stop muffling your testimony to keep the peace with people who would prefer you had stayed in the tomb. Your story, the real one, the one that begins with, I was dead, and continues with, and Jesus called me out. That story belongs to more people than just you. Every person who hears it and feels a spark of hope that maybe God could do something similar for their own dead places needs you to keep telling it.
Every person who comes to the dinner and wants to see the one who was raised is going to find something or find nothing based on whether you stayed at the table. Let yourself be scared away from it. The people who need your testimony will never hear it if you silence yourself in response to the pressure of those who are. And that leads us to what the Apostle Paul understood so perfectly and stated so bluntly in Galatians 1. For am I now seeking the approval of man or of God? Or am I trying to please man? This is the decisive interior shift that makes the difference between a testimony that continues to produce faith in others and a testimony that slowly fades under the weight of social pressure. Paul was not speaking abstract.
A group of people who operated with many of the same characteristics as the chief priests of John 12 were following him from city to city, specifically targeting the communities of faith he had established, specifically trying to undermine his credibility and his message. They could not stop his preaching directly, so they attacked his authority. They questioned his apostolic credentials. They implied that of the gospel was incomplete or dangerous. They did exactly what the chief priests planned to do to Lazarus. They went after the testimony itself because they could not stop the miracle. And Paul's response was essentially this: I have decided whose opinion governs my life, and it is not yours. When the vertical relationship, the one between you and God, the one in which he tells you who you are, what he has done for you, what he has called you to, what your life is worth, when that relationship is genuinely primary, then the horizontal opinions of people who want to contain you lose their leverage. Not because you become arrogant, not because you stop caring about people, not because you become unable to receive genuine correction, but because your identity is no longer available to be collapsed by someone else's assessment of it. You know who you are because you know whose you are, and that settled knowing makes you unmovable in a way that no amount of willpower or self-confidence could ever produce.
The people who operate with the spirit of destruction are expert at one particular weapon. They find the thing that your peace depends on that is not God, and they threaten it. If your peace depends on being liked, and your likability. If your peace depends on your reputation, they go after your reputation. If your peace depends on your standing in the community, they organize against your standing. But if your peace genuinely is in who Christ says you are, it's in the knowledge that he called you out of your particular tomb, that he sees you, that his purposes for you are not subject to a community vote, then they are working with a lever that has no fulcrum. There is nowhere to apply the pressure that will actually move you. This is why worship is such a powerful act of warfare, not because it magically removes opposition, but because it recenters you in the reality that matters most at exactly the moment when the pressure of lesser realities is trying to be most loud. Mary's anointing of Jesus in John 12 happened in the same narrative moment as the chief priest's plot against the worship and the conspiracy were simultaneous, and Jesus received the worship. He received it with full presence and full recognition of its meaning. He did not postpone the moment of worship until the conspiracy was resolved. He received the worship in the middle of the conspiracy. That is the model.
Worship in the middle of the pressure, not after it resolves. Let us look at this story through the lens of the contemporary church, because there is an application here that many people are living through right now and may not have had language for. We are living in an era that has made the construction of religious appearance easier and cheaper than at any point in human history. The same technology that allows genuine testimonies to reach millions of people in seconds also allows carefully constructed religious personas to do the same. A person with no interior transformation whatsoever can maintain for years a social media presence that radiates spiritual depth, theological credibility, and pastoral care. They can build a following. They can be trusted. They can be given access. And at the same time, in the actual texture of their daily life, in the conversations that happen outside the reach of their public platform, they can be operating from envy, manipulation, and a carefully maintained agenda to contain anyone who's anointing their relevance. This is John 12:10 with a different production value. The vestments have been replaced by a verified account. The temple in Jerusalem has been replaced by a group chat. The formal council has been replaced by a string of private messages between people who share a grievance. The form is contemporary. The spirit is ancient.
And the gift God gives us in this verse is the same gift he always gives when he wants us to see clearly. He shows us the pattern. He shows us what it looks like when it happened in its most undisguised form, so that we can recognize it once in its more sophisticated versions. There is also a word here for people who have been genuinely wounded by exactly this dynamic. People who gave their lives to a community, who were transparent and vulnerable and trusting, who shared their testimony freely, and who then watched that testimony used against them by people who were supposed to be their covering, people who were excluded from the council meetings in which their fate was decided, people who were told by an institution that claimed to speak for God that God had decided they needed to be corrected or removed, and who have been carrying the weight of that experience ever since. To you, John 12:10 says something that matters. What happened to you is named in Scripture. It is not exceptional. It is not unprecedented. It is not evidence that the church is too broken to trust, or that God is absent from human communities. It is evidence that the spirit of destruction has always found its way into religious institutions, and that God has always known it was there, and that He included a clear-eyed account of it in His Word, specifically so that the people it wounded would know they are not crazy, they are not alone, and what was done to them was not of Him.
Chief priests of the temple, the murder of a resurrection testimony, that is in the Bible. God put it there. He is not embarrassed by it. He is not trying to hide it. He included it in the inspired record of His dealings with humanity because He wanted you to have a reference point for your own experience. He wanted you to be able to say, I know what this is. I recognize this pattern. And from that recognition, He wanted you to be able to begin the work of healing. Because the healing is possible. It is real. It is the same power that raised Lazarus from the tomb. It can raise your capacity for trust from whatever tomb it has been sealed in by religious betrayal. It can give you eyes that see clearly without being clouded by the residue of past wounds. It can restore your voice, your testimony, your willingness to sit at the table in a community of genuine faith, even after you have been burned by a community that was not. That healing does not happen by pretending the wound was not real. It happens by bringing it, all of it, the anger and the confusion and the sense of betrayal, directly to the Jesus who wept at a tomb and who calls dead things back to life. He already knows what they did. He already saw the meeting. He already heard and He is already at work on something they did not plan for, your restoration. Here is what the full arc of the story in John tells us about the ultimate outcome for those who are targeted because their testimony points people toward Jesus. The chief priests succeeded in having Jesus crucified. The plan they formulated in John 11 was eventually carried out in John 19. By every earthly measure, in the moment of the cross, they had won. The teacher was dead. The movement seemed over. The threat to their institutional authority appeared to have been eliminated. And then John 20 happened. The tomb was empty. The stone was rolled away. The grave clothes were folded and left. Everything the spirit of destruction spent itself trying to destroy was not destroyed. It was transformed into something even more powerful than it had been before. The death that was supposed to be the end became the event that opened everything. The tomb that was supposed to be the permanent location of the testimony became the empty stage on which the greatest miracle of all time was declared to the world. The chief priests did not win. They thought they won. For a Saturday, it looked like they had won, but Sunday morning exists. And that is the final word that John 12:10 leaves you with. Not a word of fear, not a word of bitterness, not a word of paranoid vigilance that sees enemies around every corner. A word of settled, rooted, unshakable confidence in the God who has never yet been outmaneuvered by any plan formed in any council against any testimony He decided to preserve.
If your testimony belongs to God, if the work He has done in your life genuinely glorifies Him and draws others toward His reality, then it is not ultimately in your hands to protect. It is in His. And the God who kept Lazarus alive, despite the unanimous agreement of the religious establishment of Jerusalem to end his life, is the God who holds your testimony in the same hands. No meeting can close those hands. No coalition can overpower them. No carefully constructed counter-narrative can replace what those hands have written in your story. Here is how to walk forward from this study in a way that is both spiritually awake and spiritually healthy. Stay in the presence of Jesus. Make the table the center of your life, not the battlefield. The table is where testimony is sustained. The battlefield is where testimony is consumed. Let Jesus be the one you return to when the pressure mounts, when the criticism intensifies, when the whisper campaign reaches your ears. Return to the table. Stay there. Practice genuine discernment, not paranoia. Watch the fruit. Observe the patterns. Pay attention to whether opposition tracks with the seasons of God's most active work in your life. Pay attention to whether you can produce a specific charge against anyone who opposes you, or whether the opposition itself traffics in atmosphere rather than evidence. Pay attention to whether conversations about your situation include you or exclude you.
Let the Spirit of truth guide your perception and be genuinely open to being corrected by Him. Keep your testimony alive.
Do not silence it. Do not shrink it to the discomfort of those who are. Tell the story of what God did for you with specificity and with courage. The people who need to hear it need to hear not the sanitization that protects the feelings of the people who tried to put you back in the tomb. Your story belongs to the people God is drawing toward himself through it, not to the people who are and is something that needs to be said, because it is part of the completeness of the gospel. Pray for the chief priests in your story. Not because what they did was acceptable, not because you give them unlimited access to your life or your ministry or your interior world, but because the God who said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," is the same God who lives in you. And that God does not settle for a response to our enemies that is below his own. The spirit that moves your genuine intercession for those who have operated against you is the surest sign that your own interior has not been contaminated by what they did, that you have not secretly become, in the face of your suffering, a smaller version of the thing that hurt you, that the love of God in you is not conditioned on the behavior of others. That kind of prayer is not weakness.
It is the most powerful spiritual act available to a human being, and it positions you in a place where God can use your life for things that could not happen from a place of bitterness or closed-handed protection. John 12:10 is 11 words in English, 11 words that contain one of the most penetrating analyses of religious corruption and spiritual opposition in the entire biblical text. 11 words that describe something that happened 2,000 years ago, and something that is happening right now in cities and churches and communities around the world. 11 words that God put in his word because he knew you would need them. Not all who carry the appearance of faith carry the heart of God. There are those who wear the garments of devotion and harbor the purpose of destruction. And they target most specifically the people whose testimonies, whose living, breathing, impossible to argue with stories of what God has done, are drawing others toward Jesus. But the same verse that shows you the threat shows you the response, because Lazarus is still at the table, still alive, still the reason a great crowd is making their way to Bethany, still the irrefutable evidence of a power that no council of chiefs had the authority to stop. That is who you are. That is what your story is. That is what God is doing through the life he gave back to you. Stay, let your presence testify, and let the crowd keep coming.
Bible Unfiltered, where we go to the depth of what the Word is actually saying.